There's nothing quite like watching a man lose everything he thought mattered, only to discover what truly does. For 30 years, John Matthews had wandered from shelter to shelter, carrying nothing but shame and a heart full of regret. A crumpled letter from a lawyer changed everything when he inherited a falling-apart cabin from an uncle he barely remembered. The place was a disaster, broken windows, rotting wood, and years of neglect. But beneath the floorboards, John found a locked wooden box. Inside were family journals and a diamond the size of his thumb, wrapped in old silk. The journals revealed his ancestors believed this forgotten land held the power to heal broken lives. John faced an impossible choice: sell the diamond for enough money to escape poverty forever, or honor his family's dreams by staying. What would you choose when faced with instant wealth or a chance at redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. John Matthews folded the worn bus ticket between his calloused fingers, studying the destination one more time. Cedar Falls, Oregon. Population 847. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed before they stepped off the bus. He'd bought the ticket with his last $23, money he'd earned collecting bottles behind the downtown McDonald's for 3 weeks straight. The Greyhound lurched forward, leaving Portland's urban sprawl behind for winding mountain roads. John pressed his face against the scratched window, watching Douglas firs tower overhead like cathedral spires. It had been 43 years since he'd seen country like this. Back then, he'd been 8 years old, visiting Uncle Henry for a week each summer. His mother would pack his small suitcase with clean clothes and stern warnings about not wandering too far into the woods alone. Those memories felt borrowed now, like scenes from someone else's childhood. After the accident that took Sarah and Emma, his wife and daughter, John had methodically erased every trace of happiness from his past. The construction job went first, then the house, then his dignity. Street life had a way of wearing down a man's edges until nothing sharp remained, nothing that could cut through the numbness he'd cultivated like armor. The bus wheezed to a stop in front of Miller's General Store, the only commercial building visible on Main Street. John gathered his belongings, a canvas duffel bag held together with duct tape, containing 2 changes of clothes, a water-damaged paperback Bible, and the legal documents that had changed everything 3 days ago. The inheritance letter had found him at the downtown shelter, forwarded through a maze of social services and previous addresses. Henry Matthews, deceased 6 months ago, had left his only nephew a cabin on 47 acres in the Cascade foothills. The store clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a practical bun, looked up from her crossword puzzle as John entered. "You must be John Matthews. I'm Dorothy Miller. Heard you were coming up to look at Henry's place." Word traveled fast in small towns. John nodded, suddenly conscious of his worn boots and the 3-day stubble that made him look more vagrant than air. "Could you point me toward Willow Creek Road, about 2 miles north, then left at the big pine with the lightning scar? Can't miss it." Dorothy's eyes held the kind of gentle assessment reserved for stray dogs and lost causes. Henry was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but always helped when folks needed it. That cabin's been empty since he passed. Might be rough around the edges by now. John thanked her and began walking. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the gravel road with shifting patterns of light and shadow. His legs, accustomed to concrete sidewalks and shelter cots, protested the uphill climb. But something about the clean mountain air and the silence, broken only by birdsong and the distant murmur of running water, awakened memories he'd thought buried forever. He remembered Uncle Henry as a tall man with calloused hands and infinite patience for a city boy's questions about everything from why trees grew so straight to where deer went in winter. Henry had taught him to identify animal tracks, to read weather patterns in cloud formations, and to understand that some silences were more valuable than conversations. The lightning-scarred pine stood exactly where Dorothy had indicated, its trunk split, but still growing, bark healing around the ancient wound. John turned left onto a narrow dirt track that wound deeper into the forest. Willow Creek bubbled alongside the path, its water clear enough to reveal smooth stones on the bottom. He knelt and cupped the cold water to his lips, tasting minerals and mountain snowmelt. The cabin appeared around a bend, like something from a half-remembered dream. John's heart sank at the sight. The roof sagged in the middle, several shingles missing entirely. One window was boarded up with plywood, another cracked in a spider-web pattern. The wraparound porch Henry had built with such pride now tilted at a dangerous angle, its support posts rotted through at the base. But underneath the neglect, John could see the bones of something beautiful. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that formed a protective circle. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, solid and straight despite everything else falling apart. The logs themselves appeared sound, chinked with mortar that had held for decades. John climbed the precarious porch steps, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The front door hung slightly ajar, swollen with moisture and age. He pushed it open, hinges protesting with a long groan. The interior was a time capsule of abandonment. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through dirty windows. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and filled with old ashes. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts waiting for resurrection. The air smelled of must and mouse droppings, but underneath those odors lingered something else: coffee, wood smoke, and the indefinable scent of a place that had been truly lived in. John pulled the sheet off what turned out to be a worn leather armchair positioned perfectly for reading by firelight. This had been Henry's chair, he realized. A side table held a pair of reading glasses and a book about bird. Identification, a bookmark still marking page 47. On the mantel, framed photographs showed a younger Henry with various fishing companions, holding up rainbow trout and grinning at the camera. The kitchen occupied one corner of the main room, its cabinets handmade from what looked like the same logs as the walls. John opened them one by one, finding canned goods with dates from 2 years ago, coffee that had gone stale, and a cast-iron skillet seasoned black with use. The hand pump at the sink moved freely when he worked the handle, producing a gush of clear well water after several strokes. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft tucked under the eaves. John climbed up, disturbing a family of bats that fluttered out through a hole in the roof. The loft held a simple bed with a mattress that had seen better decades, a small dresser, and 3 cardboard boxes labeled in Henry's careful handwriting: winter clothes, books, and family papers. As evening approached, John descended to explore what Henry had always called the necessaries. A small building behind the cabin housed a surprisingly well-maintained composting toilet and a shower, fed by a gravity tank that collected rainwater from the roof. The water ran brown at first, then clear and cold. Back inside, John attempted to light the kerosene lanterns he'd found in the kitchen. The third one caught, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He settled into Henry's chair with a can of beans he'd found in the cupboard, eating them cold while watching darkness gather outside the windows. That night, wrapped in a musty sleeping bag from one of the loft boxes, John listened to the forest coming alive around him. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. The creek gurgled over stones. Small creatures rustled through the underbrush. For the first time in years, he fell asleep to sounds other than sirens and shouting voices. He dreamed of Sarah and Emma. But for once, the dreams didn't end in twisted metal and broken glass. Instead, he saw them walking hand in hand through the forest clearing, Emma's laughter bright as water over stones. When he woke to grey dawn light filtering through the dirty windows, John felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. The possibility that healing wasn't just for other people, but possibilities he knew from hard experience. were dangerous things for a man with nothing left to lose. John's second morning in the cabin began with the sound of mice scurrying across the floor above his head. He'd slept on the main room's couch, unable to face the loft's damaged roof, and bat droppings again. His back protested every movement as he stood, reminding him that 67 years of hard living had left their mark on his bones. Coffee would help, if he could get the ancient percolator working. He'd found it in one of the kitchen cabinets, along with a can of grounds that might have been older than some of the trees outside. The hand pump creaked as he filled the pot with well water. Getting a fire started in the wood stove proved more challenging. The chimney needed cleaning, and smoke kept backing up into the room until he figured out how to adjust the damper properly. While the coffee perked, John began a systematic search of the cabin's contents. If he was going to sell this place, and what choice did he have, really? He needed to know what he was dealing with. The lawyer's letter had mentioned the property, but nothing about personal belongings or potential value. Most of what he found fell into three categories: worthless, broken, or both. Henry had accumulated the usual detritus of a long life lived. Alone, outdated magazines, mismatched dishes, clothes that wouldn't fit anyone John knew. But there were also traces of the man John remembered. A hand-carved chess set with pieces worn smooth by use, a collection of geological specimens arranged on a shelf, and dozens of books about everything from forest ecology to American history. It was while examining the floorboards near the fireplace that John noticed something odd. One section of the wide plank floor sat slightly higher than the rest, as if the wood had warped with age. When he knelt and pressed down, the plank gave way with a soft creak, not warped, loose. His fingers found purchase along the edges of the board. It lifted easily, revealing a rectangular cavity carved into the floor joists below. And there, wrapped in an oiled canvas tarp, sat a wooden box about the size of a hardcover book. John's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The box was heavier than expected, made from what looked like cherry wood polished to a warm glow. Brass hinges and a small brass lock held it closed. He turned it over in his hands, noting the careful craftsmanship, dovetailed joints at the corners, a small brass nameplate engraved with Matthew's family in flowing script. The lock wasn't engaged. When John lifted the lid, the hinges moved silently, well maintained, despite years of hiding. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, lay treasures that took his breath away. A bundle of letters tied with ribbon occupied one corner. The return addresses spanned decades. Susanna Matthews, Portland, 1943. William Matthews, San Francisco, 1962. Margaret Matthews Clark, Denver, 1978. Family names he'd never heard, from relatives he'd never known existed, but it was what lay beside the letters that made John's heart race. Wrapped in a piece of silk so old it whispered when he touched it, was a diamond the size of his thumbnail. Even in the cabin's dim light, it caught the morning sun, streaming through the windows and threw rainbows across the log walls. John had never seen anything like it. The stone was cut in an old-fashioned style, with facets that seemed to glow from within. He held it up to the light, watching fire dance in its depths. This wasn't costume jewelry or some family trinket passed down for sentimental value. This was real wealth, the kind that could change a man's circumstances forever. His hands shook as he set the diamond carefully back in its silk wrapping and reached for the bundle of letters. The ribbon crumbled at his touch, decades old and brittle. The topmost letter was addressed to Henry Matthews, Willow Creek Road, Cedar Falls, Oregon, in careful feminine handwriting. The return address read, Margaret Matthews Clark, with a Denver address dated just 5 years ago. John unfolded the pages with the reverence reserved for handling ancient manuscripts. The paper was good quality, thick and cream-colored, the kind people used for important correspondence. Dear Henry, it began, I hope this letter finds you well, and that your arthritis isn't giving you too much trouble this winter. I've been thinking about our conversation at Mother's funeral, about the responsibility we carry as the last of our generation. I worry about what happens to the family stories when we're gone, about whether John will ever understand what this land meant to all of us. John's breath caught at seeing his own name. Margaret, whoever she was, had known about him, cared about his connection to this place. He read on. I know you've kept faith that John will come back someday, despite everything he's been through. I hope you're right. The land has been in our family for over a century, and it's meant to stay that way. Great-grandfather William always said this place had the power to heal broken things, broken people. Maybe John needs that healing more than any of us realized. The letter went on to discuss family matters, updates on cousins and nephews John had never met. But it was the closing paragraph that hit him like a physical blow. I've enclosed Mother's diamond, the one great-grandmother brought from Ireland. She always said it should go to whoever needed it most. And Henry, I think we both know that's John, when he's ready, when he comes home. Keep it safe for him, along with all the other stories this place holds. Love always, Margaret. John set the letter aside with numb fingers and reached for another from the bundle. This one was older, the ink slightly faded. The return address read, Susanna Matthews, Portland, Oregon, 1943. My dearest brother Henry. It began, the war has changed everything here in Portland. Robert shipped out to the Pacific last month, and I spend my days at the shipyard doing work I never imagined women could do. But at night, when the city is quiet, I think about our summers at the cabin. Do you remember the year we found the eagle's nest? And Father made us promise never to disturb it? I wonder if it's still there, if the eagles still return each spring. The letter was full of wartime concerns and family news, but near the end, Susanna had written something that made John's chest tighten. I've been having the strangest dreams, Henry. Dreams about a man walking through our forest, lost and hurting. In the dreams, he finds something hidden beneath the floorboards, something that helps him remember who he's supposed to be. Mother says dreams like that run in our family, that the women sometimes see things before they happen. I hope whoever that man is, he finds his way home. John's coffee had gone cold, forgotten in the wonder of discovery. He read letter after letter, each one adding pieces to a family puzzle he'd never known existed. There had been aunts and uncles, cousins scattered across the country. There had been births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. Through it all, the cabin had remained constant, a touchstone for people who understood something about permanence and belonging. As the mourning wore on, John found himself immersed in a history that was his own, but felt like someone else's story. These people, his people, had faced the Depression, world wars, economic hardships, and personal tragedies. But they'd endured, held together by their connection to this land and to each other. The diamond sat beside him on the coffee table, catching the light each time the sun shifted position. John found himself looking at it every few minutes, hardly believing it was real. He'd lived through 30 years of hunger, of choosing between food and shelter, of watching other homeless. People die from cold and despair. Now he held in his hands the means to escape all of that forever, but the letters complicated everything. They spoke of responsibility, of family legacy, of this land being meant for healing. John thought about Margaret's words. Great-grandfather. William always said this place had the power to heal broken things, broken people. Was he broken? The question seemed almost laughably obvious. Of course he was broken, had been since the night Sarah and Emma died in that intersection, since the drunk driver had shattered not just their car, but every plan John had ever made for happiness. But could a place really heal something like that? Could 47 acres of forest and a falling-down cabin somehow put back together what years of guilt and grief had torn apart? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. John quickly gathered the letters and diamond, returning them to their box before calling out, "Come in." An elderly woman entered, moving carefully across the uneven floorboards. She was small and bird-like, with silver hair pinned back and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She carried a covered dish that smelled like home cooking. "You must be John," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd lived in the mountains all her life. "I'm Martha Hendricks, live about a quarter-mile down the creek. Thought you might appreciate a hot meal." John stood, suddenly conscious of his appearance. He hadn't shaved since arriving, and his clothes bore the wrinkles of sleeping on a couch. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hendricks. Please sit down." Martha settled into Henry's chair as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. "I was Henry's neighbor for 43 years, she said. "Helped him tend this place when his arthritis got too bad to manage alone. He talked about you often, especially these last few years." "I should have come to see him," John said, the words heavy with regret. "I should have stayed in touch." Martha's expression softened. "Henry understood why you stayed away. He never blamed you for what happened to your family, John. He just hoped someday you'd find your way back to what matters." John looked toward the wooden box, hidden now beneath a dish rag he'd thrown over it. "I'm not sure I even remember what that is anymore." Martha's casserole turned out to be the best meal John had eaten in months. Chicken and dumplings, made the way his own mother might have prepared them if she'd lived long enough to teach him about comfort food. They ate in companionable silence, while afternoon light slanted through the cabin's grimy windows, and John found himself relaxing in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. "Henry kept a journal," Martha said, as she collected the empty dishes. "Right up until the end. Wrote in it every morning with his coffee, same as his father before him, same as his grandfather, from what I understand." John looked up sharply. "A journal?" "Several, actually, going back generations. He used to read me passages sometimes, stories about your great-great-grandfather settling this land, about the hard winters and good harvests, about family members who'd come and gone." Martha paused, studying John's face. "He wrote about you too, John, about hoping you'd find your way home." After Martha left, John climbed to the loft and opened the box labeled Family Papers. Beneath old tax documents and property deeds he found them, leather-bound journals arranged in chronological order spanning nearly a century. The oldest was so worn the leather had cracked along the spine, its pages yellowed with age. He carried them down to Henry's chair and began with the most recent volume. Henry's handwriting was careful and precise, the script of a man who understood that words mattered. "March 15th, 2023, read the first entry John opened to. "Snow melting fast this year, creek running high and muddy. Been thinking about John again, wondering if he got the Christmas card I sent to that shelter in Portland. Martha says I should stop hoping, that some wounds never heal, but this land has seen enough broken people find their way back to wholeness. Maybe John just needs more time." John's throat tightened as he read on. Entry after entry chronicled Henry's daily life, weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance projects around the cabin, but woven through the mundane details was a persistent thread of hope, of faith that his nephew would eventually return. April 3rd, 2023. Found an eagle's nest in the big pine down by the creek bend. Same tree where Susanna and I watched the pair raise their young back in '58. Some things endure, even when everything else changes. Made me think of something Mother used to say. The land remembers everything, Henry. It remembers joy and sorrow, birth and death. But mostly it remembers love. I wonder if John remembers the summers he spent here. I wonder if he knows this place remembers him too. The words blurred as John's eyes filled with tears he'd thought long dried up. He could see Henry so clearly, sitting in this same chair, writing by lamplight, keeping faith with a nephew who'd vanished into the grey anonymity of street life. The waste of it struck him like a physical blow. All those years Henry had hoped, had waited, had saved these stories and this place for a reunion that came 30 years too late. He flipped backward through the journal, reading random entries. Henry had documented everything. The year a family of foxes denned under the porch, the winter the creek froze solid for the first time in memory, the spring when wildflowers bloomed so thick the meadow looked like a carpet of stars. Through it all ran Henry's quiet philosophy, his understanding of how a man's life fit into the larger patterns of seasons and soil and sky. October 12th, 2022. First hard frost last night. Gardens finished for the year except for the winter squash. Been reading Susanna's old letters again, the ones she wrote from Portland during the war. She had such faith that this place would endure, that it would be here when people needed it most. I think about John living in the city, and I wonder if he remembers what silence sounds like, what clean air tastes like, what it feels like to watch the sun set through trees instead of between buildings. John set the journal aside and reached for an older volume, this one dated 1987-1995. The handwriting was different, still Henry's, but stronger, more confident. The entries from this period were longer, more philosophical. June 20th, 1991. Summer solstice, longest day of the year, and I spent it thinking about time, how it moves differently here than in the city. John turned 16 yesterday, though I doubt he remembers, I know. Sarah sent a picture with their Christmas card. He's tall like the Matthews men, has our stubborn chin. I hope someday he'll understand that some gifts can't be opened until a person is ready to receive them. John remembered that birthday, or rather, he remembered the party Sarah had thrown for him in their small apartment. She'd made a chocolate cake from a box mix and invited 3 of his school friends. They'd played video games and eaten pizza, and John had felt like the luckiest teenager in Portland. Now, reading Henry's words, he realized he'd had an uncle. Thinking about him that same day, an uncle who'd saved every school photo Sarah had sent over the years, the guilt was overwhelming. While Henry had been maintaining this place, holding on to family history, hoping for a reunion that never came, John had been systematically destroying every connection to his past. After the accident, he'd thrown away photo albums, donated Sarah's belongings, sold their furniture. He'd wanted to erase every trace of happiness because it hurt too much to remember what he'd lost. But Henry had remembered for him. Henry had kept the stories, preserved the connections, maintained the hope that someday John would need to know who he'd been before tragedy reshaped his life. John opened the oldest journal, dated 1956-1965. The handwriting was different again. This must have been Henry's father, John's grandfather. The voice was formal, old-fashioned, but the observations were equally careful. September 8th, 1962. Henry brought the boy up for Labor Day weekend. John's 8 now, old enough to appreciate the forest without trying to tame it. Showed him the eagle's nest, same one Henry and Susanna found 20 years ago. Different. Birds, same ancient purpose. The boy has good instincts, moves quietly through the woods, listens before he speaks. He'll make a fine caretaker of this land someday when his turn comes. When his turn comes. The phrase resonated in John's chest. Like a bell. Had this always been his destiny? Had 4 generations of Matthews men preserved this place, recorded its stories, maintained its buildings, all for the possibility that someday John would claim his inheritance? The thought was too big, too heavy with responsibility. John closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that surrounded him. In the fading light, the trees seemed like guardian sentinels, watching over secrets too old for any one person to carry alone. That night, he lay on the couch listening to the creek and thinking about different kinds of wealth. The diamond hidden in the wooden box could buy him a small house, maybe a car, certainly enough food and shelter to last his remaining years. But the journal spoke of a different kind of inheritance. Stories and responsibilities, connections that stretched backward and forward through time. Martha's words echoed in his mind. He just hoped someday you'd find your way back to what matters. What mattered? John had spent 30 years believing that nothing mattered, that loss had stripped meaning from his life as thoroughly as it had stripped away his family. But lying here in Henry's cabin, surrounded by evidence of love and hope and patient faith, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong. Maybe what mattered wasn't what you'd lost, but what you chose to do with what remained. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about finding a way to honor it while still moving forward. Maybe this place really did have the power to heal broken things, broken people. But first, he had to decide whether he was brave enough to let it try. John's third morning at the cabin began with a disaster. The ancient wood stove, which had been smoking intermittently since his arrival, finally gave up entirely. Thick, black smoke poured into the main room, setting off a coughing fit that left him gasping on the porch in the cold dawn air. When the smoke cleared, he surveyed the damage. Soot covered everything, the furniture, the journals he'd left on the coffee table, even the windows. The cabin looked like the site of a small explosion, which in a way it was. Years of creosote build-up in the chimney had finally caught fire and burned itself out, leaving behind a mess that would take days to clean properly. But as John stood there, covered in soot and feeling more defeated than he had since arriving, he noticed something else. On the workbench near the kitchen, beneath, a layer of dust and now soot, sat a pair of worn leather work gloves. They were large, clearly made for a man's hands, and still held the shape of fingers that had gripped countless tools over the years. John picked them up, recognizing them as Henry's. The leather was soft and supple despite its age, broken in by decades of honest work. He slipped them on and found they fit perfectly. For a moment, standing there in his soot-covered cabin wearing his uncle's gloves, John felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. A sense of belonging to something larger than his own problems. The feeling didn't last long. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and John opened it to find a young man in an expensive suit standing on the tilted porch. Everything about him screamed city money, from his polished shoes to his perfectly styled hair. "Mr. Matthews?" The man extended a manicured hand. "I'm Brad Templeton from Cascade Development Corporation. I heard you'd arrived to assess the property." John didn't take the offered handshake. Something about the man's smile reminded him of the social workers who'd processed his paperwork at various shelters. Professionally pleasant, but fundamentally indifferent to the human being standing before them. "I'm not looking to sell," John said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if they were true. Templeton's smile never wavered. "I understand completely. This kind of decision takes time, but I'd like to make you an offer that might change your mind. Cascade Development is prepared to pay $200,000 for this property, cash, closing within 30 days. $200,000. The number hit John like a physical blow. Combined with what the diamond might bring, he'd have enough money to disappear forever, to buy a small place somewhere warm, to live quietly and comfortably for whatever years he had left. "That's a generous offer for property in this condition," Templeton continued, his eyes cataloguing the cabin's obvious decay. "Frankly, the structure itself has no value. We're paying for the land and the water rights." "Water rights?" "Willow Creek runs through your property for almost half a mile. Clean mountain water is becoming increasingly valuable, Mr. Matthews. Very valuable." John looked toward the creek, visible through the trees as a silver ribbon in the morning light. He'd been drinking that water for 3 days, washing in it, listening to its constant murmur as he fell asleep. The idea of someone owning it, controlling it, seemed fundamentally wrong. "I need time to think," he said. "Of course." Templeton handed him a business card. "But don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't last forever." After the developer left, John found himself staring at the business card with the same intensity he'd studied the diamond. Both represented escape from his current circumstances, but they pulled him in opposite directions. The diamond connected him to family history, to people who'd believed this land meant something. The developer's offer would sever those connections permanently. He spent the morning cleaning soot from the cabin's interior, working methodically through each room. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. As he worked, wearing Henry's gloves, John began to notice details he'd missed during his first survey. The log walls were solid, despite their age. The stone foundation showed no signs of settling. The roof leaked in only 2 places, both easily repaired with the right materials. Under the soot and neglect, the cabin revealed itself as fundamentally sound. Henry had built it, or rebuilt it, judging from some of the newer timbers, with the kind of craftsmanship that was meant to last. The joints were tight, the proportions pleasing. With work and attention, it could be beautiful again. But work required time, and time required money. John pulled out the papers that had come with the inheritance and spread them on the now clean coffee table. Property taxes, utility connections that had been turned off, insurance policies that had lapsed. The numbers told a sobering story. Even if he kept the place, even if he somehow found the money to make it livable, maintaining it would cost far more than a homeless man could afford. That afternoon, Martha arrived with another casserole and found John sitting on the porch, staring at the creek. "You look like a man wrestling with angels," she observed, settling into the chair Henry had placed beside the door for visitors. "More like wrestling with devils," John replied. "A developer came by this morning, offered me 200,000 for the place." Martha was quiet for so long that John looked over to make sure she was all right. Her face had gone pale, and her hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Cascade Development?" she asked finally. "You know them? They've been sniffing around the area for 2 years now, buying up properties, clear-cutting the timber, putting in vacation homes for rich folks from Portland and Seattle." Martha's voice carried an anger John hadn't heard before. "They tried to buy Henry's place 3 times. He told them where they could stick their offers. Maybe Henry could afford to turn down money like that. I can't. Can't you?" Martha's blue eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "John, what do you think you need money for?" The question caught him off guard. "Food, shelter, basics, necessities. You've got shelter right here. The creek provides water, and with some work you could have a garden that would feed you year-round. Henry heated this place with deadfall from the forest and cooked on a wood stove for 40 years. A man can live simply if he's willing to learn how." John thought about the diamond, hidden beneath the floorboards. Martha didn't know about that. Didn't know he had another option beyond selling the land. But her words stirred something in him. A memory of a different way of living. During those childhood summers, he'd watched Henry tend his garden, preserve vegetables for winter, repair everything instead of replacing it. It had seemed like poverty then, viewed through a child's eyes, accustomed to city conveniences. Now it looked like something else, independence maybe, or self-respect. "Henry left you something besides the cabin," Martha said, as if reading his thoughts. "He left you a choice. You can take the easy money and walk away, or you can do the hard work of figuring out who you want to be." That evening, John climbed to the loft and opened the box labeled Family Papers again. This time, he looked past the journals to examine the official documents beneath. Property deeds going back to 1889, when his great-great-grandfather had first homesteaded this land. Survey maps showing the original 47 acres, plus water rights to Willow Creek. Insurance policies and tax records documenting 4 generations of Matthews men who'd found ways to hold on to this place despite economic hardships, wars, and personal tragedies. At the bottom of the box, he found something he'd missed before, a manila envelope sealed with wax. His name was written across the front, in Henry's careful script, "For John, when he's ready to understand." John broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with Henry's handwriting. "My dear nephew," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way home at last. I've prayed for this day more times than I can count, though I always knew it might come after I was gone. The land has been waiting for you, John. It's been waiting since the day you were born." The letter went on to explain what John had already begun to understand from reading the journals. The cabin and land weren't just property. They were trust, a responsibility passed down through generations. Each Matthews man had faced the same choice: preserve the land for future generations or sell it for immediate gain. Each had chosen preservation, despite personal hardships. "I know you've suffered losses I can barely imagine," Henry had written. "I know the world has been cruel to you in ways that would break lesser men, but perhaps that suffering has prepared you for this moment." has given you the wisdom to understand what truly matters. This land has been waiting for someone who knows what it means to lose everything, someone who understands that some treasures become worthless the moment you try to spend them. The diamond was never meant to make you rich, John. It was meant to give you choices. You can sell it and use the money to restore this place, to make it a sanctuary for others who need healing. Or you can keep it as security, knowing that you have something of value if times become desperate. But I hope, I pray, that you'll find a third option, something none of us were wise enough to imagine. Whatever you decide, know that you are loved. Know that you are home. Know that this place has been holding its breath for 30 years, waiting for you to return and help it exhale. Your loving uncle, Henry. John folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling with emotion. Outside, the forest was settling into evening quiet, and he could hear Martha moving around in the kitchen, preparing something that smelled like his childhood memories of comfort food. The weight of decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He had spent 30 years believing he had nothing left to lose, but now he found himself facing choices that could determine not just his own future, but the fate of something much larger than himself. Through the window, he watched the last light fade from between the trees. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new tests of his resolve. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, John felt something approaching peace. Not the peace of having made the right choice. He hadn't made it yet, but the peace of finally understanding what the choice truly meant. The land was offering him redemption, but redemption always came with a price. The question wasn't whether he could afford to pay it, but whether he could afford not to. John spent the next morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly than he had. Since arriving, in the corner where the kitchen met the main room, partially hidden behind a pile of old newspapers, he discovered something that stopped him in his tracks. Carved directly into one of the massive support beams was an intricate family tree, its branches spreading across the wood grain like living growth. At the base, in careful letters, was inscribed, William Matthews, 1889-1963. Above him, connected by carved lines that represented marriage and descent, were the names of his children, Henry Matthews, 1920-2023, and Susanna Matthews, 1922-1987. From Susanna's branch spread more names, John's father Robert, his mother Patricia, and finally, at the very edge of the carved space, John Robert Matthews, 1956, with a dash, but no ending date. Someone had been waiting for him to come home and finish his own story. John traced the carved letters with his finger, feeling the careful indentations Henry must have worked on during long winter evenings. Below the family names in smaller script were dates and brief notations. William claimed the land, Henry built the cabin, Susanna kept the stories, Robert served his country, Patricia brought music to the mountains. At the bottom of the carving, in fresh-looking letters that must have been added recently, Henry had inscribed a single word, John. The question mark hung there like a challenge. What would John's contribution be? What would complete the story that 4 generations had been writing on this land? Before he could wrestle with that question, another knock interrupted his thoughts. This time it was Martha, but she wasn't carrying food. Her face was pale, and she moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to show pain. I need to sit down, she said, lowering herself into Henry's chair with a grimace. John brought her a glass of water and waited while she caught her breath. When she looked up, her blue eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there the day before. My heart's acting up again, she said simply. Doctor says I need to start thinking about moving closer to town, maybe into one of those assisted living places. The news hit John harder than he expected. In just 3 days, Martha had become his anchor to this place, his connection to Henry's memory and the land's history. The thought of losing her felt like losing family all over again. How long? He asked. Hard to say. Could be months. Could Be years, but I can't keep living alone so far from help. Martha studied his face. That's part of why I wanted to talk to you, John. This valley's changing. People like me, people who remember what it used to be like, we're disappearing. Soon there won't be anyone left who knows the old stories. She gestured toward the family tree, carved into the beam. Henry spent 40 years keeping this place exactly as his father left it, preserving it for you, for the day you'd come back, and take up the responsibility. But preservation isn't enough anymore. The developers, the city people looking for weekend retreats, they're not interested in history. They just see opportunities. As if summoned by her words, the sound of a vehicle coming up the dirt road broke the forest quiet. Through the window, John watched a black SUV with tinted windows park beside the cabin. 3 men got out. Brad, Templeton, and 2 others John didn't recognize. All wore expensive suits that looked out of place in the wilderness setting. "Mr. Matthews," Templeton called as he approached the porch. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." John stepped outside, unconsciously wearing Henry's work gloves. "I told you I needed more time." Of course. But I wanted to introduce you to some colleagues who might help clarify the situation." Templeton gestured to the other men. "This is Jim Carlson, our geological consultant, and Dave Morrison from our legal department." Carlson stepped forward, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Mr. Matthews, we've completed a preliminary survey of your property. I think you should know that the timber alone is worth substantially more than our initial offer suggested." John felt Martha tense beside him. Clear-cutting the forest would destroy everything that made this place special. The wildlife habitat, the pristine watershed, the sense of stepping back in time that had begun to heal something broken inside him. "We're prepared to increase our offer to $350,000, Morrison added. "That's more than fair market value for property in this condition. $350,000. Combined with whatever the diamond might bring, it represented more money than John had ever imagined possessing. Enough to disappear completely, to reinvent himself somewhere warm and anonymous. Enough to never worry about food or shelter or the judgment of strangers again. But as he looked at the forest surrounding them, at Martha's worried face, at the carved family tree, visible through the cabin's window, the money felt less like freedom and more like betrayal. "I appreciate the offer," John said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make a decision." Templeton's professional smile slipped slightly. "Mr. Matthews, I should mention that we have other options. If you decide not to sell voluntarily, there are legal mechanisms that might compel a sale, unpaid taxes, for instance, code violations. It would be unfortunate to go that route, but sometimes property owners leave us no choice." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. John felt Martha's hand touch his arm, a warning not to respond in anger, but Henry's gloves on his hands reminded him of something else, of the stubborn Matthews' determination that had held this land for over a century despite economic hardships and outside pressure. "Are you threatening me?" John asked quietly. "Not at all," Morrison interjected smoothly. "We're simply pointing out that maintaining property like this requires significant resources that might be challenging for someone in your circumstances to obtain." They knew about his homeless years, had probably investigated his financial situation before making their approach. The knowledge that they'd been watching him, studying him like a problem to be solved, sparked something John hadn't felt in decades: protective anger. "I think this conversation is over," he said. After the men left, John and Martha sat in silence for several minutes. The forest around them seemed to whisper with secrets, with stories of other confrontations, other threats to the land's integrity that had been faced and overcome. "They're not giving up," Martha said finally. "No, they're not." Henry faced the same pressure, not just from developers, but from family members who thought he was foolish to hold on to a place that required so much work and generated so little income. His own brother wanted him to sell and move to town. John turned to look at her. What did he do? What Matthew's men have always done. He dug in deeper. Started learning everything he could about forest management, water rights, conservation easements. Turned himself into an expert on the very laws the developers thought they could use against him. Martha smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Course. Henry had something you don't. What's that? Time. He had 40 years to prepare for fights like this. You've got maybe weeks before they find some legal pretext to force your hand. That evening, alone again with Henry's journals, John found himself reading with new urgency. Scattered through the daily observations and philosophical reflections were references to legal battles, property disputes, environmental assessments. Henry hadn't just been a caretaker, he'd been a strategist, quietly learning how to protect what he loved from those who would exploit it. May 15th, 2019, read one entry. Lawyer in town says conservation easements might be the answer. Donate the development rights to a land trust. Keep the tax benefits. Guarantee the forest stays intact forever. Been thinking about it all week. Problem is, easements are permanent. Once signed, there's no going back. What if John needs the money? What if circumstances change? Some decisions you can only make for yourself, not for people who come after. John closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit forest. Henry had faced the same impossible choice now confronting him. Immediate financial security versus long-term responsibility to something larger than personal need. But Henry had had the luxury of time to wrestle with the decision. John had developers circling like vultures, legal threats hanging over his head, and his own desperate circumstances pushing him toward the easy solution. The carved family tree seemed to watch him from across the room, its unfinished question mark a reminder that some stories demanded completion regardless of personal cost. But was he strong enough to write an ending worthy of 4 generations of faith? Was he brave enough to choose uncertain difficulty over guaranteed comfort? Outside, an owl called across the darkness, its voice carrying all the wild loneliness of places where humans were visitors rather than owners. John pressed his palm against the cool glass and wondered if he was hearing the sound of home, or saying goodbye to the only place that had ever offered him redemption. Martha arrived the next morning, carrying a small wooden box and walking more slowly than John had seen before. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes held the same determined light that had sparked when the developers made their threats. "I brought you something that belonged to Henry," she said, settling carefully into the porch chair. "Something he asked me to give you when the time was right." The box was similar to the one John had found beneath the floorboards, but smaller, made from pine rather than cherry. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, was a collection of handwritten recipe cards held together with a rubber band. "Family recipes," Martha explained. "Passed down from your great-grandmother through Susanna to Henry. He copied them all out by hand. Said someday you'd want to know how your people cooked." John lifted the cards with careful fingers. The handwriting varied, some in flowing feminine script, others in Henry's careful printing. "Susanna's apple butter," read one. "Great-grandmother's Irish soda bread," read another. Each recipe included notes about variations, substitutions, memories attached to the food. "Henry and I used to cook together sometimes," Martha continued. "Sunday dinners mostly, holidays when the loneliness got too heavy for either of us to bear alone. He'd tell stories about the women who'd first made these dishes, about family gatherings in this very cabin when it was full of voices and laughter." John found a card written entirely in Henry's handwriting. "Martha's chicken and dumplings, the recipe that saved my life during the winter of '98 when pneumonia nearly took me. A dish made with love feeds more than the body. You saved his life." Martha's cheek flushed pink. "Henry was always prone to exaggeration. I just brought him soup when he was sick, made sure the fire didn't go out. Same thing neighbors have been doing for each other in these mountains for over a century." But John heard something in her voice, saw something in the way she looked at the cabin's windows that suggested a deeper connection than simple neighborliness. Had there been love between them? The thought hadn't occurred to him before, but now it seemed obvious. Two lonely people, both devoted to this place, both understanding what it meant to choose roots over convenience. "Martha," he said gently, "were you and Henry—" "We were what we were," she interrupted, but not unkindly. "Two old people who found comfort in each other's company. We talked about marriage once, years ago, but Henry said this place was meant for the Matthews family. He couldn't ask me to share a burden that wasn't mine to carry." The sadness in her voice cut through John like a blade. How many sacrifices had been made to preserve this land? How many personal desires had been set aside in service of some larger purpose? "He was wrong about that," John said. "The burden, I mean. You carried it too." Martha smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all morning. "Thank you for saying that, John. It means more than you know." They spent the morning cooking together, preparing one of Henry's favorite meals from the recipe cards. As Martha guided him through the process of making cornbread from scratch and slow-cooking beans with salt pork, John felt another piece of his heritage settling into place. This was how his people had lived, simply carefully, making do with what the land provided and finding satisfaction in small, daily rituals of sustenance. But their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of official vehicles coming up the road. Two county sheriff's cars and a sedan with government plates parked in front of the cabin. John's stomach dropped as uniformed officers emerged, followed by a woman in a business suit carrying a clipboard. "John Matthews." The woman stepped forward, with the brisk efficiency of bureaucracy in motion. "I'm Lisa Chen from the County Building Department. We're here to conduct an inspection of this structure." John looked at the paper she handed him. Code violation notices, safety concerns, environmental impact assessments. The legal threats Templeton had made were becoming reality. "This is harassment," Martha said, rising from her chair with dignity despite her obvious fatigue. "This cabin has stood for 70 years without bothering anyone." "Ma'am, we're just doing our job," one of the deputies replied. "Multiple complaints have been filed regarding potential safety and environmental violations on this property." John watched helplessly as the inspection team spread through his cabin, photographing everything, making notes, measuring distances between structures and the creek. They found violations everywhere. Outdated electrical systems, non-compliant septic arrangements, fire code issues with the wood stove, lack of proper permits for various improvements Henry had made over the decades. The estimated cost of bringing this structure up to current code would be approximately $60,000, Chen announced, after an hour of documentation. "You have 30 days to begin remediation or face condemnation proceedings. $60,000. John didn't have $60, let alone 60,000. The diamond hidden beneath the floorboards might cover the costs, but selling it would leave him with nothing for his own survival. The trap was perfectly constructed, comply with regulations he couldn't afford, or lose the property to bureaucratic machinery designed to favor those with resources. After the officials left, John and Martha sat in stunned silence. The cornbread had burned while they watched their lives being catalogued and judged. The smell of charred food seemed appropriate somehow, a symbol of how quickly careful plans could turn to ash. "This is exactly what they did to the Henderson place last year," Martha said finally, "and the Morrison property the year before that. Find violations, demand expensive fixes, then swoop in with cash offers when people can't afford to comply. How did Henry avoid this for so long? He was careful, kept everything technically legal, even if it was old-fashioned. But mostly, I think he had friends in the county office who looked the other way when possible. Those friends have retired now, been replaced by people who see dollar signs instead of heritage." That afternoon, John found himself back at the family tree carving, staring at the unfinished question mark after his name. What would his contribution be? Would he be remembered as the Matthews who gave up? The one who sold 4 generations of faith for a developer's check? He pulled out his phone, a cheap flip model he'd bought at a convenience store, and dialed the number on Brad Templeton's business card. The man answered on the second ring. "Mr. Matthews, I was hoping you'd call. Have you reconsidered our offer?" "The county came by today," John said. "Code violations, 60,000 in required improvements. I'm so sorry to hear that." Templeton's voice carried fake sympathy that didn't fool anyone. "These old properties often have compliance issues. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality of modern regulation. Your offer still stand?" "Actually, given the new information about required improvements, we'd need to adjust our offer downward. Say 250,000. Still very generous considering the circumstances." John closed his eyes. They were squeezing him like a vice, reducing their offer now that legal pressure made his position desperate. In a week, they'd probably offer even less. "I need more time," he said. "Time is a luxury you might not have, Mr. Matthews. Code enforcement doesn't wait for personal readiness." After ending the call, John climbed to the loft and retrieved the wooden box from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the diamond in his palm, watching it catch the afternoon light streaming through the dirty windows. Here was his escape. This single stone could buy him compliance with county codes, could give him the breathing room to make decisions based on desire rather than desperation. But selling it felt like selling his soul, betraying the trust of relatives who'd preserved it through wars and economic hardships, who'd believed it should go to whoever needed it most. Did he need it most? Or did the land itself need it more? Did 4 generations of Matthew's dreams deserve to die because he was too broken to fight for them? The diamond seemed to pulse with its own inner fire, holding all the light it had gathered. Over decades of hiding, like the land itself, it had waited patiently for the right moment, the right purpose, the right person brave enough to claim it. John closed his fist around the stone and felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, exactly, but the possibility of healing. The understanding that some battles were worth fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. Outside, the creek continued its eternal murmur, and the forest held its breath, waiting to see what choice he would make. Martha returned the following morning, but this time she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a man John didn't recognize, elderly, with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He carried a leather satchel and moved with the careful precision of advanced age. "John, I'd like you to meet Walter Kimball," Martha said as they climbed the porch steps. "He was Henry's lawyer for 30 years. There are some things you need to know." Walter settled into Henry's chair and opened his satchel with deliberate care. His hands shook slightly as he withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "I should have come sooner," he said, his voice carrying the weight of regret. "But Henry made me promise to wait until you were ready to hear the whole truth. Martha says recent events have forced our hand." John felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that always preceded bad news. "What truth?" Walter spread several documents across the small table beside his chair, official-looking papers with government seals and technical language. "These are geological surveys of your property, John. Surveys Henry commissioned but never shared with anyone except me." John leaned forward to examine the papers. They were filled with technical terms he didn't understand, but the maps were clear enough. His property was outlined in red, with various symbols and notations scattered across the interior. "What am I looking at?" "Mineral rights assessment," Walter replied. "Your land sits atop one of the largest undeveloped copper deposits in the Pacific Northwest. Conservative estimates put the value at somewhere between $50 and $70 million. The number hit John like a physical blow. $70 million. It was beyond comprehension, beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. The diamond, hidden beneath the floorboards, was pocket change compared to this revelation. "Why didn't Henry tell me?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha and Walter exchanged glances before Martha answered. "Because Henry knew what you'd do with that information. Same thing any sensible person would do. Sell it and disappear. He didn't preserve this place for 40 years so it could be turned into a strip mine." Walter pulled out another document, this one handwritten in Henry's careful script. This is a letter Henry wrote to you, to be delivered only if outside pressure threatened the land's integrity. I think recent events qualify. John took the letter with trembling hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind Henry had used. For important correspondence. My dear John, it began, if you're reading this, it means someone has discovered what I've tried to keep secret for 20 years. The land you've inherited is worth more money than our family has ever dreamed of. Possessing. It's also worth more than money can measure. When the Geological Survey first revealed the copper deposits in 2003, I faced the same choice now confronting you. Instant wealth beyond imagination, or preservation of something that can't be replaced once it's gone. I chose preservation. But I've always wondered if I had the right to make that choice for future generations. Now that choice belongs to you, and I won't insult you by pretending it's easy. $70 million could solve every problem you've ever had, could buy you comfort and security for the rest of your life. But strip mining would destroy not just the forest, but Willow Creek, the wildlife habitat, the sacred quiet that has healed our family's wounds for over a century. I've spent my life believing this land holds something more precious than copper, the possibility of redemption, of connection to something larger than our individual wants and fears. But beliefs aren't facts, and faith isn't financial security. You'll have to decide for yourself what has greater value. John set the letter aside, his mind reeling. Everything he'd understood about his situation had just changed. This wasn't about choosing between poverty and modest comfort anymore. This was about choosing between unimaginable wealth and environmental preservation on a scale that affected entire ecosystems. The developers know, don't they? He asked. Walter nodded grimly. Cascade Development is a front company for Extractive Industries International. They've been assembling properties in this valley for 3 years, quietly buying up mineral rights, while telling owners they're interested in vacation home development. That's why they want the water rights, Martha added. Mining operations need enormous amounts of water, control Willow Creek, and they control access to the entire deposit. John walked to the window, looking out at the forest with new eyes. Somewhere beneath those trees, beneath the carpets of ferns and the generations of fallen leaves, lay enough copper to make him one of the wealthiest men in Oregon. The knowledge felt like a curse rather than a blessing. What happens if I refuse? To sell. They'll find other ways, Walter replied. Eminent domain claims for public benefit, environmental assessments that mysteriously favor development. Legal challenges to your ownership based on technicalities. These companies have resources and patience. They'll grind you down until resistance becomes impossible. Unless, Martha said quietly, we find a way to make the land unsellable. Both men turned to look at her. She was studying the geological surveys with the focused attention of someone working through a complex problem. Conservation easement, she continued. Donate the development rights to a land trust. Make it legally impossible to mine, no matter who owns the property. Walter shook his head. The tax benefits from a $70 million easement would be enormous, but John would still need income to live on, and once those rights are donated, they can never be recovered. It's permanent. John thought about the diamond upstairs, about the choice between selling it for survival money or honoring his family's faith. Now that choice seemed quaint compared to what he faced. How did someone walk away from $70 million? How did anyone possess that kind of moral courage? But as he watched a family of deer emerge from the forest to drink from Willow Creek, John began to understand something Henry had tried to tell him through 40 years of journal entries. Some things were valuable precisely because they couldn't be bought or sold. Some treasures became worthless the moment you tried to cash them in. There's another option, Walter said slowly. Something Henry and I discussed but never implemented because the timing wasn't right. What kind of option? Walter pulled out a final document from his satchel. Community land trust, instead of donating the development rights to an outside organization, you could transfer ownership to a trust controlled by local residents. The land stays protected, generates modest income through sustainable forestry and conservation programs, and the community has a say in its future. But John would give up ownership, Martha pointed out. Not ownership, control. There's a difference. Walter's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a lawyer who'd found an elegant solution to an impossible problem. John would retain a life estate, the right to live on the property for the rest of his days. After that, the trust ensures the land is preserved according to the principles he establishes. John felt something shift in his understanding, like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places. This wasn't just about his choice anymore. This was about creating a legacy that honored both his family's faith and his community's future. How long do I have to decide? Not long, Walter admitted. The code enforcement actions are just the beginning. Once Extractive Industries realizes you know about the mineral deposits, they'll escalate their pressure dramatically. That evening, alone again with his thoughts, John climbed to the loft and retrieved the wooden box one final time. The diamond lay in his palm, like a captured star, beautiful and mysterious and suddenly insufficient. What good was a single precious stone when the entire mountain held treasures beyond measure? But as he studied the faceted surface, John realized the diamond's true value had never been monetary. It was a symbol of faith. Faith that someone, someday, would be brave enough to choose connection over comfort, responsibility over riches, legacy over mere survival. His great-grandmother had carried this stone across an ocean, believing in possibilities she would never live to see. His family had preserved it through generations of hardship, trusting that eventually it would reach someone who needed it most. John needed it now, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented. The courage to make choices based on love rather than fear, on hope rather than desperation. Outside, the forest settled into evening quiet, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called across waters that ran free and wild and clean. John closed his fist around the diamond and felt the weight of 4 generations settling on his shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as strength. John found Henry's final letter exactly where Martha had said it would be, tucked inside the family Bible that sat on the cabin's single bookshelf, between the books of Matthew and Mark. The placement wasn't accidental. Henry had always been a man who understood the power of symbols. The envelope bore John's name in faded ink, sealed with the same red wax Henry had used for important documents. Inside, written on the thick paper Henry reserved for special occasions, was a message that felt like a voice from beyond the grave. "My beloved nephew," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have discovered the choice that has defined 4 generations of Matthew's men. I pray you will have the wisdom I sometimes lacked and the courage I often questioned in myself. Now you know about the mineral deposits, about the wealth that lies beneath our feet. You also know about the forces arrayed against anyone who would choose preservation over profit. I've spent my life preparing for this moment, not by accumulating resources to fight them, but by accumulating faith. Faith that when the time came, the right person would emerge to carry our family's burden forward. That person, John, is you. Not because you are perfect, but because you are broken in the right ways. Not because you have everything to gain, but because you have everything to lose. The land has been waiting for someone who understands that some treasures become worthless the moment you try to spend them. I have left you tools for the fight ahead, but the choice of whether to use them remains yours alone. In the cedar chest beneath my bed, you will find documents Walter and I prepared over 20 years of careful planning, legal frameworks, financial structures, community partnerships, everything needed to preserve this place for future generations who will face their own impossible choices. But know this above all else: I will not judge you for whatever decision you make. You have already survived more loss than any person should bear. If you choose the money and the freedom it represents, you will have my blessing and my understanding. If you choose the harder path, you will have my eternal gratitude. The land will endure either way. The question is whether it will endure. As a place of healing or as another scar on the earth's surface, I have always believed that you will choose healing, not because it is easy, but because it is who you are meant to be. Remember that you are not alone in this fight. Martha carries our family's story as surely as any blood relative. Walter understands the legal complexities better than any man alive. The land itself will be your strongest ally if you learn to listen to what it needs. One final thing. In the chest with the documents, you will find something that belonged to your grandfather, a ring he wore every day of his adult life. It is a simple thing, gold worn thin by decades of honest work, but it carries the weight of all who came before. You wear it when you need to remember that you are part of something larger than yourself. Go well, my boy. Make whatever choice allows you to sleep peacefully under these stars, with love and faith eternal, Uncle Henry. John set the letter aside, with hands that shook more from emotion than age. The cedar chest sat exactly where Henry had described, beneath the bed in the small alcove that served as the cabin's only bedroom. The wood was dark with age but well maintained, its brass corners bright with polish. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that smelled of lavender and thyme, John found treasures that redefined his understanding of wealth. Legal documents prepared by Walter and Henry over 2 decades of collaboration. Articles of incorporation for the Willow Creek Community Land Trust, with blanks left for signatures and dates. Conservation easement agreements that would permanently protect the forest. From development, financial projections showing how sustainable logging and ecotourism could generate modest but steady income for whoever managed the property. But it was the small velvet box at the bottom of the chest that stopped John's breath entirely. Inside lay a simple gold band, worn thin but unbroken, inscribed on the inside with words he could barely make out. William and Sarah Matthews, 1918. His grandfather's wedding ring, kept safe through 3 generations of separation and loss. John slipped the ring onto his finger, surprised to find it fit perfectly. The gold was warm against his skin, as if it had been waiting 60 years to return to its proper place. For a moment, standing in the dim cabin with his grandfather's ring on his hand and Henry's letter in his heart, John felt the presence of all who had come before, their struggles, their hopes, their unshakable faith that this place mattered more than personal comfort. The feeling of connection was interrupted by the sound of vehicles on the road. Through the window, John watched a convoy approaching, 3 black SUVs, followed by a truck carrying surveying equipment. Extractive Industries had apparently decided to stop playing games. Brad Templeton emerged from the lead vehicle, but he wasn't alone this time. A small army of men in expensive suits and work clothes spread across the clearing, setting up equipment, taking photographs, measuring distances. They moved with the efficiency of an occupying force that expected no resistance. John stepped onto the porch, wearing Henry's work gloves and his grandfather's ring, feeling the weight of 4 generations settling into his bones. He wasn't the same broken man who had arrived here just a week ago. The land had begun its work on him, the way it had worked on all the Matthews men who had chosen to stay and fight for something larger than themselves. "Mr. Matthews," Templeton called out, approaching with the confidence of someone who believed money could solve any problem. "I think it's time we had a frank conversation." "I'm listening. We know about the geological surveys. We know about the mineral rights. We also know about your current financial situation." Templeton gestured toward the surveyors, who were setting up equipment along the creek bank. "We're prepared to make you an offer that reflects the true value of this property, $15 million, cash, closing within 10 days, $15 million. Still a fraction of the land's actual worth, but more money than John could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Enough to disappear forever, to buy anonymity and comfort in some place where no one knew about his past or his failures. "That's a generous offer," John replied carefully. "It is extremely generous considering the legal complications surrounding your ownership." Templeton nodded toward another man who had emerged from the second SUV, older, wearing the sort of conservative suit that suggested serious money and serious power. "This is Richard Blackwood, CEO of Extractive Industries. He wanted to meet you personally." Blackwood approached with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His handshake was firm, his smile calculated to inspire, confidence and intimidation in equal measure. "Mr. Matthews, I've heard a great deal about you, about your journey to this property." The pause was deliberate, a reminder that they knew everything about his homeless years, his vulnerabilities, his desperate circumstances. "I want you to know that we admire your sentimental attachment to this place. But sentiment doesn't pay medical bills or provide security in old age." John felt Martha's presence before he saw her, emerging from the forest trail that connected her property to his. She moved slowly but with dignity, her chin raised in defiance, despite her obvious fatigue. Behind her walked Walter Kimball, carrying his leather satchel and wearing the expression of a lawyer prepared for battle. "Gentlemen," Walter said as he approached the group, "I trust you have appropriate permits for conducting surveys on private property without the owner's consent." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "We're conducting preliminary assessments in anticipation of Mr. Matthews' cooperation. Nothing more." "I see. And do these assessments include soil sampling, water testing, activities that might constitute trespass?" Under Oregon law, the CEO's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Kimball, isn't it? We've heard about you, the old lawyer who thinks environmental regulations can stop economic progress." Walter's smile remained steady. "I prefer to think of myself as someone who understands that some forms of progress aren't worth their true cost." John watched this exchange with growing awareness that forces much larger than his personal circumstances were at play. The diamond in the wooden box upstairs suddenly seemed like a child's toy compared to the industrial machinery of extraction and development arrayed against him. But as he looked at Martha's determined face, at Walter's quiet confidence, at the forest that had sheltered 4 generations of his family, John felt something stirring in his chest. Not courage exactly, but the recognition that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying more authority than he'd possessed since before the accident, "I think it's time you left my property." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, but he gestured to his team. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Matthews. Very soon." As the convoy departed, leaving dust and the smell of exhaust lingering in the clean mountain air, John realized he had just crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The war for Willow Creek had officially begun. That night, wearing his grandfather's ring and surrounded by Henry's journals, John began planning for the fight of his life. Outside, the forest held its ancient silence, waiting to see whether the latest Matthews man would prove worthy of the trust placed in him. The diamond lay on the table before him, catching firelight like a captured star. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to use it as a weapon in the battle ahead or as a bridge to the life he'd never dared imagine possible. Tonight, for the first time in 30 years, John Matthews was no longer just surviving. He was preparing to live. The old lawyer who thinks he can stop progress with outdated environmental regulations. Blackwood finished. "I assure you, Mr. Kimball, we have teams of attorneys who specialize in navigating such obstacles." Walter's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "I'm sure you do. Just as I'm sure they've advised you about the legal complexities of extracting minerals from property protected by federal conservation easements." John watched the exchange with growing amazement. Walter moved through the legal chess match with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. every document in Henry's cedar chest, every carefully worded agreement, had been designed for this confrontation. There are no conservation easements on this property, Templeton interjected, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Not yet, Walter agreed. But Mr. Matthews has 30 days to file such documents with the appropriate federal agencies. 30 days during which any development activities would be considered premature and potentially actionable under multiple environmental protection statutes. Blackwood's expression shifted from confident to calculating. Mr. Matthews, perhaps we should discuss this privately, away from advisors who might not have your best interests at heart. John felt Martha's hand touch his arm, a gentle reminder of everything they had discussed over the past week. He looked at the forest surrounding them, at the ancient trees that had stood through decades of storms, at the creek that ran clear and cold from mountain springs, at the clearings where deer emerged each evening to drink. This place had been waiting for him not just for the weeks since Henry's death, but for all the years of his wandering, waiting for him to remember what mattered more than personal survival. "My advisors have my complete trust," John said. "Whatever you want to say to me, you can say in front of them." Blackwood studied John's face for a long moment, clearly reassessing his assumptions about the homeless man he'd expected to manipulate easily. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from condescending to respectfully direct. "Very well, Mr. Matthews, I'll be frank with you. This property sits on one of the most valuable mineral deposits we've identified in the Pacific Northwest. We're prepared to offer you $25 million for full ownership, including mineral rights. That's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. 25 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with possibilities. John could buy a house, multiple houses. He could travel anywhere in the world, eat in the finest restaurants, never worry about money again. He could disappear from everyone who had ever known him as a failure, reinvent himself as a success story. But as he considered the offer, John found himself remembering other numbers. 4 generations of Matthews' men who had chosen this land over easier alternatives. 47 acres that provided habitat for countless species, a creek that supplied clean water to communities downstream, a forest that cleaned the air and sequestered carbon and offered healing to broken souls who stumbled onto its trails. "And if I refuse?" John asked. "Then we'll pursue other options," Blackwood replied. "Legal challenges to your ownership, environmental assessments that favor development, extended court battles that will cost you everything you don't have, while enriching lawyers who don't care about your sentimental attachment to trees." The threat was delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, but John heard the steel beneath the politeness. These men weren't going away. They would use every tool at their disposal, legal, financial, political, to extract the copper from his land. His refusal would only determine how painful they made the process. "How long do I have to decide?" "The offer expires at midnight tonight," Templeton said. "After that, our legal team takes over, and the terms become significantly less favorable." John looked at Martha, whose blue eyes held 43 years of memories about this place, at Walter, who had spent 2 decades preparing legal defenses for a battle he'd hoped would never come, at the surveying crew, who were photographing every tree and measuring every structure with the methodical thoroughness of men planning destruction. "I need an hour," John said finally. Blackwood checked his expensive watch. 1 hour. We'll wait in town." After the convoy departed, John found himself alone with Martha and Walter on the cabin's tilted porch. The forest around them seemed to exhale in relief. But John knew the respite was temporary. Whatever decision he made in the next hour would echo through generations. $25 million, Martha said quietly. "John, that's more money than anyone in my family has ever seen, more money than anyone in this entire county has ever seen. It's also irreversible," Walter added. "Accept their offer. And this place becomes a strip mine within 5 years. Everything Henry preserved, everything your family built, gone forever. John pulled the deed transfer documents from his jacket pocket, the papers he'd prepared after reading Henry's letter, signed and witnessed and ready for filing. The Willow Creek Community Land Trust would own the property by tomorrow morning if he chose that path. The land would be preserved, the community would benefit from sustainable income, and John would retain the right to live here for the rest of his days. But he would also be choosing poverty over wealth, uncertainty over security, responsibility over freedom. At 67, with no savings and limited options, was he brave enough to bet his remaining years on principle? Henry faced the same choice 20 years ago, Martha said, as if reading his thoughts. He could have sold to the first mining company that discovered the deposits. Instead, he spent 2 decades learning how to protect what he loved. John thought about the journals, about 40 years of daily entries documenting Henry's relationship with this place, the careful observations of weather patterns and wildlife behavior, the philosophical reflections on what it meant to be a caretaker rather than an owner, the persistent hope that someone would eventually understand why preservation mattered more than profit. What would you do? John asked Walter. The old lawyer was quiet for so long that John wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom. I've seen a lot of clients face impossible choices, John. The ones who chose money usually spent the rest of their lives wondering if they'd sold their souls. The ones who chose principle sometimes struggled financially, but they slept better at night. John walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at Willow Creek, running clear and cold through the forest his family had protected for over a century. Somewhere beneath those waters lay copper worth millions, but the creek itself was priceless. A living system that supported everything from microscopic organisms to the bears that fished for salmon each fall. Could he live with himself if he sold all of this for money he didn't really need? Could he face whatever came after death, knowing he had traded healing for wealth, legacy for luxury, hope for security? The answer, when it came, felt as inevitable as sunrise. John was still standing by the creek when the convoy returned, right on schedule. He watched the black SUVs park in formation, their occupants emerging with the confidence of people who expected capitulation. But something had changed in the hour they'd been gone. Word had spread through the small community, and now other vehicles lined the dirt road, pickup trucks and aging sedans belonging to people who understood what was at stake. Dorothy Miller from the general store stood near her battered truck, arms crossed and jaw set. Tom Henderson, whose family had lost their property to similar tactics the year before, leaned against a fence post with the grim satisfaction of someone watching justice finally served. A dozen other faces John didn't recognize, but somehow knew, belonged here, belonged to this place in ways that corporate executives never could. Quite a gathering, Blackwood observed as he approached the porch. His smile had returned, but it carried less warmth than before. I hope you haven't been sharing confidential information about our negotiations. Nothing confidential about it, Martha replied from her chair. Everyone in the valley knows what you people do to places like this. John stepped forward, feeling the weight of his grandfather's ring and the strength of his community's presence. In his hand, he carried the deed transfer documents, signed, witnessed, and ready for filing. The moment of choice had arrived with the clarity of dawn after a long night of uncertainty. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I've made my decision. The CEO's expression shifted to one of satisfied anticipation. $25 million was a lot of money, but it was a fraction of what they would extract from the land over the next decade. He probably viewed John as just another homeless man who had stumbled into luck and was smart enough to cash in while he could. Excellent. My legal team is prepared to expedite the paperwork. I'm refusing your offer, John interrupted. All of your offers. This land is not for sale. The silence that followed was so complete that John could hear the creek murmuring 50 yards away. Blackwood's face cycled through surprise, disbelief, and finally a cold anger that transformed his features into something predatory. "Mr. Matthews, I don't think you understand the full implications of that decision. We're prepared to pursue this matter through every available legal channel." "I understand perfectly." John held up the deed transfer documents. "That's why I'm transferring ownership of this property to the Willow Creek Community Land Trust, effective immediately. The mineral rights will be donated to the state of Oregon for permanent conservation. No individual or corporation will ever be able to extract copper from this land." Walter stepped forward with the formal precision of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll find copies of all relevant documents in my briefcase. Conservation easements filed with both state and federal agencies this morning. Community Land Trust articles of incorporation submitted to the Secretary of State's office. Environmental protection agreements that make any mining activity legally impossible." John watched understanding dawn on the faces around him. The community members smiled and nodded. They had known this moment would come, had hoped for it, had gathered here to witness it. The corporate executives looked stunned, then furious, as they realized their carefully orchestrated pressure campaign had not only failed, but had been anticipated and countered at every turn. "This is a mistake," Templeton said, his professional composure cracking. "You're walking away from generational wealth for a handful of trees and a creek that doesn't even belong to you anymore." "You're right," John replied. "It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to everyone who understands that some things are worth more than money." Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You think this is over? We have resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, political connections, regulatory agencies that understand the economic importance of resource extraction. We'll find ways to reverse these agreements." "Maybe," Walter said calmly, "but it won't be easy, and it won't be quick. And every day you spend fighting us is another day this forest remains protected." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment a new voice cut through the tension. Dorothy Miller stepped forward, her silver hair catching the afternoon. "Light like a crown of authority. Mr. Blackwood, you and your people need to leave. Now. This is private property and you're not welcome here." Other community members moved closer, forming a loose circle around the corporate delegation. There were no threats, no aggressive postures, just the quiet determination of people who belonged somewhere defending it against those who did not. Blackwood looked around the circle of faces, calculating odds and outcomes. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him that discretion was the better part of corporate valor. He gestured to his team, and they began loading their surveying equipment with sharp, efficient movements. "This isn't over, Matthews," he said, as he walked back to his SUV. "Enjoy your poverty. Enjoy watching this place decay around you, while you survive on the charity of people who can't afford to help themselves." After the convoy departed, the community members remained for a while, as if reluctant to let the moment end. They congratulated. John shook Walter's hand, hugged Martha with the gentleness reserved for elderly relatives. Gradually, they drifted back to their vehicles and their own lives, but the sense of shared victory lingered in the forest air. As evening approached, John found himself alone on the porch with Martha and Walter, watching the light fade between the trees. The enormity of what he had done was beginning to settle in. He had walked away from $25 million. He had chosen to be the caretaker of land that would never make him wealthy, never provide him with luxury or ease or security. But he had also chosen to be part of something larger than his own needs. He had chosen to honor the faith of relatives who had preserved this place for someone they would never meet. He had chosen healing over wealth, connection over isolation, legacy over mere survival. "No regrets?" Walter asked quietly. John looked out at the forest, at the creek running silver in the twilight, at the clearing where deer would soon emerge to drink. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate. Somewhere beneath his feet, copper veins ran through the earth like buried treasure that would remain forever buried. "None," he said, and meant it completely. Martha reached over and patted his hand, the hand that wore his grandfather's ring and bore the calluses of honest work. "Henry would be proud," she said. "Your whole family would be proud." As full darkness settled over the forest, John felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident that took Sarah and Emma. He felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was part of a story larger than his own pain. The land had healed him not by erasing his losses, but by giving him something worth protecting, something worth the sacrifice of personal comfort for communal good. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the practical work of managing a community, land trust, the financial realities of living simply, the ongoing legal battles that extractive industries would surely wage. But tonight, sitting on the porch of the cabin his family had preserved for over a century, John Matthews was finally home. 6 months later, John woke to the sound of hammering coming from the direction of the creek. He smiled as he recognized the rhythm, steady, purposeful, the cadence of someone who knew what they were doing. Tom Henderson and his 2 sons had volunteered to help rebuild the footbridge that had washed out during the spring floods. It was the kind of community project that happened regularly now that the Willow Creek Community Land Trust was fully operational. John dressed slowly, his joints protesting the morning chill. At 67, he felt every year of hard living, but there was a difference now in how his body carried pain. It was the pain of honest work rather than despair, of purpose rather than aimlessness. His hands bore fresh calluses from learning. Carpentry skills Henry had tried to teach him 40 years ago. His back ached from cutting firewood and tending the garden Martha had helped him plant where Henry's old vegetable patch had been. The cabin itself bore little resemblance to the decaying structure he had inherited. New shingles covered the roof, replacing the ones that had leaked through countless storms. The windows sparkled with glass that actually let in light rather than filtering it through decades of grime. The porch no longer tilted dangerously, but stood level and solid, supported by posts cut from trees that had fallen naturally in winter windstorms. But the most significant change wasn't visible to casual observers. It was the sense of purpose that filled every corner of the restored space, the understanding that this place served something larger than one man's comfort. The main room now doubled as a meeting space for the Land Trust Board. The kitchen regularly fed volunteers who came to work on trail maintenance or wildlife habitat restoration. The loft had been converted into a small library where visitors could learn about forest ecology and conservation practices. John started his morning coffee with the ritual precision of someone who had finally learned the value of routine. The percolator was new, a gift from Dorothy Miller, who insisted that a man in his position needed reliable equipment. But he used Henry's old coffee cups, thick ceramic mugs that had warmed the hands of 3 generations of Matthews' men. While the coffee perked, John opened his journal, a leather-bound volume similar to those Henry had filled for 40 years. His own entries were shorter, less philosophical than his uncle's, but they served the same purpose, documenting the daily life of someone who had chosen to pay attention to the world around him. October 15th, he wrote in careful script. First, frost last night. Garden finished except for the winter squash and root vegetables. Tom and his boys making good progress on the bridge repairs. Should be ready for the hiking group that comes through next week. Martha feeling stronger since her heart medication was adjusted. She's talking about teaching a cooking class in the cabin next month, using the family recipes. Funny how food connects people to places in ways that nothing else can. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted his writing. John looked up to see a young woman standing at the door, backpack slung over her shoulders, and the slightly lost expression of someone who wasn't entirely sure she was in the right place. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Sarah Chen from Portland State University. Dr. Wilson said you might have time to talk with me about the land trust model. John set down his pen and studied the young woman's face. She couldn't have been more than 25, with earnest eyes and the kind of idealistic energy that reminded him of his own daughter at that age. Graduate students and researchers had become regular visitors to the cabin, drawn by word of a community land trust that had successfully fought off corporate development. "Come in," John said, pouring coffee into one of Henry's mugs. "What would you like to know?" Over the next hour, Sarah asked the kinds of detailed questions that John had learned to expect from academics. How had they structured the legal agreements? What were the ongoing funding mechanisms? How did they balance conservation with public access? John answered as best he could, though he always felt like an imposter during these conversations. 6 months ago, he had been homeless and broken. Now people treated him as an expert on community organizing and environmental protection. "The thing is," John said, as their conversation wound down, "I didn't create any of this. I just inherited it from people who were smarter and more patient than I am. My uncle spent 20 years preparing for the fight we won in a single afternoon. But you made the choice," Sarah pointed out. "You could have taken the money and walked away. Most people would have." John considered this as he walked her to the door. Most people probably would have taken the money. The decision he had made still sometimes kept him awake at night, not with regret, but with amazement at his own capacity for sacrifice. Who was he to turn down $25 million? Who was he to choose principle over security? But those questions mattered less now than they had in the beginning. The land trust was generating modest income through carefully managed timber sales and eco-tourism programs. John's own needs were simple: food, shelter, the occasional medical checkup. In town, Martha had moved into the cabin's renovated loft after a fall, convinced both of them that they were better off sharing space than living alone. Their arrangement was part caretaking, part companionship, part family bond that transcended blood relations. That afternoon brought another visitor, Walter Kimball. Carrying his leather satchel and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who had recently won a significant victory, the state Supreme Court rejected extractive industry's final appeal, he announced without preamble. The conservation easements are permanent and binding. They can't touch this place, John, not ever. The news should have brought relief, but John found himself feeling something more complex. The legal battles were over, which meant the land was safe, but it also meant the end of the chapter that had given his life meaning. What was a dragon slayer to do when all the dragons were dead? "What happens now?" John asked. "Now we do the work we always intended to do," Walter replied. "Manage the forest sustainably, provide education about conservation practices, serve as a model for other communities facing similar pressures." "Quiet work," Martha added from her chair by the fireplace. "The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but changes the world one person at a time." That evening, after Walter had left and Martha had retired to the loft, John sat alone with Henry's journals spread across the coffee table. He had been reading them chronologically, working his way through decades of daily observations. Tonight, he reached the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Henry's death. March 3rd, 2023. "Snowing hard tonight, but spring is coming. I can feel it in the air, smell it in the wind. The land is getting ready to wake up from winter's sleep, same as it has for 10,000 years. Makes me think about cycles, about how everything connects to everything else across time. Been having dreams about John again? Different dreams than before. In these dreams, he's not lost anymore. He's found something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for. Maybe that's just an old man's wishful thinking, but I don't think so. The land remembers everything, and it remembers him. When he's ready, it will call him home. I won't live to see it, but that's all right. Some stories take longer than one. Lifetime to complete. My part was to keep the place safe until the right person came along to carry it forward. If I've done that job well, nothing else matters. The eagles are back. building a nest in the big pine by the creek. Same tree where Susanna and I watched them raise their young 70 years ago. Some things endure. Some things are worth preserving for their own sake, not for what they can provide, but for what they represent. Hope, maybe. Continuity. The understanding that we're all part of something larger than our individual desires. Time for bed. Tomorrow I'll start teaching myself about community land trusts. Never too old to learn new ways to protect what you love. John closed the journal and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Henry had died, believing his nephew might someday return, might someday understand what this place represented. The faith had been rewarded, but Henry hadn't lived to see it. That was the hardest part of choosing principle over profit. The people who had made the choice possible rarely lived to enjoy the victory. But maybe that was part of the point. Maybe preservation was always about future generations rather than present comfort. Maybe the real measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you left behind for others to build upon. John opened his own journal and began to write his final entry of the day. The legal battles are over. The land is safe permanently. Tonight I'm thinking about Henry, about all the Matthews men who chose this place over easier alternatives. I'm thinking about the students who will come here to learn about conservation, about the families who will hike these trails and drink from this creek, about people I'll never meet who will benefit from choices made by people they'll never know. 6 months ago I was homeless and hopeless, carrying nothing but guilt and regret. Tonight, I'm sitting in a warm cabin, surrounded by family photographs and community friends, knowing that tomorrow will bring work worth doing. The land healed me, not by erasing my losses, but by giving me something worth living for. Martha is right about quiet work, being the kind that changes the world. Not through grand gestures or headlines, but through daily choices to protect what matters, to nurture what heals, to preserve what can't be replaced. I understand now why Henry waited so long for me to come home. Some gifts can't be received until the recipient is broken in exactly the right ways, until they understand that real wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with connection. To land, to community, to something larger than individual need. The family tree carved into the cabin's beam has my name at the end of a long line, followed by a question mark. I know now what my contribution will be. I'll be remembered as the Matthews man who chose healing over wealth, community over isolation, legacy over luxury. I'll be remembered as the one who came home. Outside, the forest settled into evening quiet, and Willow Creek murmured its ancient song of water over stones. John closed the journal and sat listening to sounds that had welcomed 4 generations of his family home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to prove that some things were indeed worth more than money. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, John Matthews slept peacefully under stars that belonged to everyone and no one, in a place where healing was possible and hope was currency enough for any man brave enough to invest in tomorrow.